Good morning, party people. Happy Sunday. It is the sun is rising. This is like kind of unusual for us. Usually when I start at like 6 a.m. Pacific, I don't think the sun has been rising for a while during these streams. I saw that. Neil, welcome. Good to see you, Neil. Shane says good morning. Melissa says good morning from over on YouTube. And I had to laugh when Richie posted a message. Richie says, so are we still doing this? Yeah, so originally I wasn't supposed to be doing anything this morning. VTOL Free, good to see you. I wasn't going to originally do anything this morning because I have a weekend emergency client this weekend, but I was taking a break from the findings. You know how we, in the US, we have spring forward and fall back? Well, I was supposed to fall back, and at 2 a.m., the clock, pops backwards to 1 a.m. Well, I wake up at 1:59, just not every day, I just happened to this morning. 1:59, I wake up, and I look at my clock, and I'm like, oh, this is great. I'm, ahead, things are, normal. I slept in a little bit. And then I go hop in the shower, and I get out of the shower, and I'm like, 1:15 a.m., oh, man. So I could have slept in an hour. Not that I don't know that I would have been able to, but at least I probably could have. So that was kind of crappy. Ditovi, G-Surgeon from the Netherlands. Good to see each of y'all. So let's see here. The way that this works is we do totally open questions and answers. You can ask me anything that you want in SQL Server. I work through first come, first serve. So don't freak out if I don't get to your question right away. I am copying the questions into a queue, and I just work through them in a queue. If I see your question come in multiple times, I'll just delete it because that's how I roll. This is my webcast, not your webcast. And Abused Sysadmin says, see, I'm going out of order already. Abused Sysadmin says, what time do you go to sleep? I usually sleep around between 8 and it's like 7:30 to 8:30 p.m., somewhere inside there, and then wake back up in the morning around 2 ballpark. So usually at work around 3. But then on the flip side is I immediately flip out at 1 p.m. I'm out for a nap. So as Richie can attest. All right, so first up, YouTube asked, over on Venkat on YouTube said, good morning, what could be the import from a support perspective for Microsoft on running databases with 2012 compat on the SQL Server 2017 or 2019? So Microsoft, it's in their best interest to get your money. And the way that they get your money is by having you on the latest and greatest version of SQL Server. So for that, they want to make sure that your old crappy applications can still work on brand new awesome versions of SQL Server. That's why they continue to maintain the old versions of compatibility level in there. That doesn't mean to guarantee that if you got something that's only certified on SQL Server 2012, that doesn't mean that it's going to perform exactly the same on SQL Server 2017 and 2019, but it's just supposed to be at least compatible, not necessarily supported. If your vendor says you can only run on 2012, compat level isn't going to be enough. So just in terms of the support from Microsoft, Microsoft loves it. They're like, come on, anything, as long as you can get your apps over here. You won't get all the cool features, like there are some things that you have to be in the latest compat mode in order to get, but for a support perspective, which is what your question is, you're completely fine. Next up, let's see here. Let's add a couple of the other questions into the queue. So let's see here. Yeah, awesome is a good question there. Let me paste a couple more things into the queue there. So there we got that. And then copy that in over here. All right, so from Facebook, Nelson says, how do I tune my queries? Do you have some tips I can share? Nelson, I do, as a matter of fact. I have entire classes full of them. And, whoopsie, it just so happens that that's this week's sponsor. This week's sponsor is my own Black Friday sale. I know, that's my sleazy, spammy voice, because I always feel whenever I pitch my own stuff that I feel kind of sleazy or spammy. But this week we're running, or this month actually, we're running our Black Friday sale. So if you go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, we're running massive, like 80, 90, 86%, I think is the highest off in terms of percentages. So you can attend all my live classes for an entire year. I teach you how to tune indexes, how to tune queries, you name it. So that's over at brentozar.com/Black Friday. Do I have tips? Holy cow, I have so many tips that I have like 3 weeks worth of classes in order to share them all with you. And I totally wish I could just, give them to you in 60 seconds, but of course that's why I teach weeks of classes. Peter says, why are you imitating my voice? Good morning, Georgia. Welcome to the golf course. Next up, Chris says, is there any benefit to having more than 128 gigs of RAM? Oh, I tell you what, that's my emergency client this weekend, has 384 gigs of RAM, and it's probably not going to be enough. We're going to have to go to a terabyte or two. So classic examples, there are really two kinds of servers. There's transactional servers, and there's reporting servers. Transactional users get pissed when their queries take more than 3 or 4 seconds. Like if you go to hit enter on a web page to fill out your shopping cart or add something to the cart or update your profile, if it takes 4 seconds, users are pissed. They're closing the web browser. Whereas on the other extreme, if you have a reporting system, if every report finished in 3 or 4 seconds, users would be high-fiving you in the hallway, they'd be hugging you, buying you things. Of course, all those nasty behaviors that we as people, we don't really like anyway. If you have a transactional server, everything has to be instantaneous, and you have to wait on disk in order to fetch pages up into RAM so you can do an insert, update, or delete, that's usually catastrophic. For a really fast OLTP server, a transactional server, we usually need stuff in RAM. That's why you may need more RAM than that. So if you have a multi-terabyte OLTP database, for example, you may need multi-terabytes of RAM. Next up, G-Surgeon says, what does it mean if CX consumer is significantly higher than CX packet? So when Microsoft brought out CX consumer, the idea was that CX consumer was supposed to be the harmless wait type. Amongst parallelism, we've always had for these years this confusion between harmless and harmful wait types. But the thing is, they didn't quite execute it right. I'll show you what I mean. If you go open a browser and you search for CX consumer site brentozar.com, so if you search CX consumer and then site brentozar.com, that'll give you a link that Eric Darling wrote showing a demo query where the only wait type that a query generates is CX consumer, and it's terrible. The query just goes on and on and on, and parallelism is the problem inside that query. So the idea was that you weren't supposed to have to worry to distinguish between CX consumer and CX packet. CX consumer was supposed to be the harmless one. CX packet was supposed to be the bad one. What we found out since Microsoft brought these out is that they can both be harmful or harmless. So you still really can't tell anything between the two. So that's why I still group those two types together, because Microsoft's execution didn't quite match up to what they were going for. Next up we have, let's see here, Control K, Control C DBA says, Brent, can you name some good data profiling tools except SSIS? So what data profiling usually means is that you want to see the distribution of your data. Like, for example, if you have a last access date or a creation date or an account number type, you want to see the kinds of data that are compared in it. I don't do that kind of work, so I wouldn't be able to give you a good example. I know that Richie wrote one a long time ago, but he hasn't maintained it either. So the place that I would actually ask that is on Twitter. I would use the SQL help hashtag and ask that over on Twitter, and there are going to be people who are more current with data warehousing than I am, because I just don't do that kind of thing. D. Tovey says, thanks for the courses last week. The first day was long and hard work. The other 2 days were easier. I appreciate your time. My pleasure. I always love doing these kinds of open streams to help people and help people like hit the accelerator on their skills. Because as long as you show up, that shows the initiative, and then I can go teach you all kinds of fun stuff. I just love sharing those kinds of things. Plus, it's kind of like you're my virtual coworkers. You know, there aren't a lot of people around here that do the same thing that I do. You know, my wife is always joking around, like she'll ask me how my day, if I had a good day, and I'll say, oh yeah, you know, I had a great day and I started doing this and that and I'm helping the client do this. And she's like, a simple yes or no would have been fine. Did you have a good day or not? You know, so that's our running joke. She does care, and she knows a lot more about the SQL Server community than she even knows Surly Dev's name. I mean, like the, you know, handle name, doesn't know Surly Dev personally. Although Surly Dev, the year you were at SQL Bits, you might have actually seen Erica, because she came in to drop off a power supply for Eric at one point, and I can't remember if I told the audience that she was in the audience, but she came up. That was kind of funny. But also a round of applause for Surly Dev, because he helps make sure that the stream runs naturally. He copies all your crazy questions over into the queue so that then I can deal with the questions in the queue. Next up, VTech Fred from Nashville says, hot wings, says, are function IO statistics included when the function is called from a stored procedure? IO, no. Time, yes. So IO is not, but time is. You can see it in the total CPU time across the entire stored procedure in set statistics time on, but unfortunately not IO. Next up, near and dear to my heart. Greg, not that Greg G. Bargsley is near and dear to my heart, although he is, but also the question was near and dear to my heart. How do you decide what metrics to capture when doing a performance comparison? If I'm doing a comparison for like CPU, disk, memory for restore and CheckDB. What I like to do is I like to look at your production server, the one that you're replacing. Look at the production servers. Oh, I should have thought of that. Neil, I should have had them ask you in here. So for the person who was asking about profiling, that's the answer there from Neil. The primary server's weight types. Is the primary server primarily bottlenecked on CPU or storage or memory grants? What's that server's primary bottleneck? Because when you're replacing it with a new VM, a new SQL Server version, whatever, you want to make sure that your primary bottleneck goes down. Sure, you would love to make sure that all the bottlenecks go down, but at least start by making sure that the primary one goes down. So for example, in the one that I'm working with this weekend, it's CPU bottlenecked. We don't really have that much of a memory problem or a locking problem or an IO problem. Biggest one is mostly CPU. So then as we compare different kinds of servers, we're going to be looking at SOS scheduler yield weights and seeing if SOS scheduler yield weights go down. I teach more about that in my Mastering Server Tuning class. That's Mastering Server Tuning. Next up, Pythor. Pythor says, I have a process that pulls data, XML data from an API, passes it to a stored proc, uses a lot of resources. Is there an option for optimizing XML in SQL? Ugh. So Microsoft, when they brought out XML processing inside SQL Server, it kind of felt like they were checking a box. As in, people like XML? We need to handle XML. Okay, now we handle XML. But they haven't really invested anything in performance tuning it. And we saw the same thing with JSON data, Ruby, or not Ruby, R, Python, Java in the database. They're frantically checking boxes, but not necessarily going back and giving you performance tuning tools or making it easier to tune. So the thing that I would usually say is, don't process XML data inside SQL Server. SQL Server Standard Edition is $2,000 US per core. Enterprise Edition is $7,000 US per core. So your app servers are $0 US per core. Do XML processing over on the app server if you're trying to go faster. Gallant Josh, it is. It's from Festival of the Spoken Nerd. Very good idea, good eye there. Girls who do boys like their girls. Love that. Oh, thanks. Peter says, run, don't walk to buy these classes. Peter can say that because he's been in a lot of my training classes, and he didn't have to pay for it. His employer did. But he's right. Then I loved the old They Might Be Giants song hotline. They Might Be Giants, a band back from the 80s, 90s, and they still do stuff today. They used to have and I think they still do, a dial-a-song hotline, and you would call it, and it was like a Brooklyn long-distance number. They were always like, it's always free when you call from work, and that's kind of how I feel about my training classes out there on for other folks buying them. SB Help DBA says, hello, Brent. My head still aches from the last 3 days, but it is a nice pain. I kind of feel like my job is to rapidly expose all kinds of things in SQL Server to make it easier for you to write better queries, do better indexing, build better servers, etc. Oh, interesting. Sai says, or asks, is there such a thing as a SQL API that communicates with JCL or mainframe-related operating systems? So you can get linked server drivers so that you can write a T-SQL query and it'll connect to a mainframe. It's a very inefficient way of doing it, though. I don't know a lot of people who are happy with it in terms of performance. So what I would say is, when you want to write an API and do anything with an API, just connect directly to the server that has the data that you want. If you want data from a mainframe, go connect to the mainframe. It's kind of like, Sai, if I wanted to ask out like a friend of yours, if I was like, oh, Sai, your friend is, really attractive, I'd like to ask them out on a date, I wouldn't pass you a note. I'd be just like, Sai, go get me their phone number, give it to me, or even, why would I do? Nobody likes phones. Nobody picks up phones. But get me their, Twitch handle or whatever, and I'll just talk directly to them. Just cut out the middleman, go directly to them. I don't know why that turned into a dating metaphor, but it did. The Almighty Beard asks, do you have any set of favorite trace flags in the context of performance tuning that you use every now and then? Oh, wow, that's a great question, and the answer is no, but I need to tell you why. The thing with trace flags is that they're kind of less documented, less tested routes through the SQL Server engine code. Microsoft has its hands full just getting the regular SQL Server code paths to work at all. They don't do extensive testing with all kinds of trace flags. I want to take the safest, most predictable route through the SQL Server engine code, so I tend not to use trace flags. There is, if you search support.microsoft.com, you're going to want to use Google, obviously, but search support.microsoft.com for supported trace flags. There are trace flags you can throw into queries. I just want to give my SQL Server the best chance at having a predictable code path through that's going to work after I leave. Like, my goal when I tune a SQL Server is I don't want to touch it again for 3 years. I want other people to do all kinds of other stuff on there without me having to come back. And as soon as I start throwing in trace flags, I get really nervous about how that server is going to perform when I'm not around. Now, having said that, I've seen there are trace flags that don't bother me very much. So when people use 1222 for deadlocks, 1224 for deadlocks, 4199 for compatibility level fixes. I mean, if they use anything that's out of the supported trace flags, I'm like, okay, yeah, if you want to use that, I'm fine with it. But I don't use some. It's not that I never would. I mean, I have during some cases, but just you asked for my favorites, and I'm like, nah, I'd never throw them in by default. Abused sysadmin, well, I always like that. Abused sysadmin says, is Postgres less efficient than SQL Server? Oh, and you want, I'll do this. I'm going to copy in those Facebook questions, Surly Dev, just because I don't know if you're over there, and that's the wrong one. That's the wrong dang one. Let me copy this. Hold on a second here. Copy, or maybe not. There we go. So Abuse Sysadmin says, is Postgres less efficient than SQL Server? I have a 12-core, 96 gig of RAM that does practically nothing, and it's slower than an 8 proc, 48 gig of RAM that gets used gets used heavily. They're different. So Postgres, for example, it's harder to get parallel query execution plans than it is in SQL Server. Postgres has CTEs as optimization fences, whereas SQL Server does not. But Postgres also has advantages that SQL Server doesn't have. From what I've heard from people who work with spatial processing, Postgres is way faster at spatial processing, like GIS stuff, than SQL Server is. I wouldn't compare between the two in terms of like less efficient or more efficient. The thing to remember with Postgres is it's free. Woo! So if you take a SQL server that costs, say, $50,000 and you compare it with a Postgres server that costs $50,000, you can throw a lot of hardware in for 50 grand, whereas when you're paying the SQL Server licensing, you can only pay for very little hardware when you have to throw the licensing in. So you just want to be aware that the licensing cost has a mix into play too. Next up, Twitcher Squared. Twitcher Squared asks, the case of very fast buffer pool extension. My friend implemented BPE, querying how is it possible? So how is it possible that something is faster than something else? How is it possible that one thing is faster than anything else? I have no idea. The one thing I would say is average read microseconds. I wouldn't trust any measurements out of SQL Server in terms of microseconds. My guess is you have a bigger problem, and I have no idea just from that one quick question what the bigger problem is. This is the kind of place where if you really care about it, you post the full details of everything out on like dba.stackexchange.com, but expect to do a lot of back and forth with people because there are so many questions that I would have to ask for clarification. If you wanted to hire me for consulting, you could. It just seems like an odd thing to go, to ask for consulting for. So it's a huge, massive question, basically. How could one thing be faster than the other? And you can imagine how that opens all kinds of doors. Let's see here. Data Train said, so Neil Hambley said, regarding the data profiler question, look at Azure Data Studio and the visualizations in that product. Oh, that's an interesting thought. Now, just keep in mind that with both Azure Data Studio and with Power BI, you are going to be scanning the entire object. You're going to be reading the contents of that object. So the more columns that you have and the more rows that you have, the longer that kind of thing can take. If you want to visualize data in terms of profiling it, I would just make sure to try and do that in a data or a dev or QA environment. Don't try to run tools like that in production. Not that you can't run Power BI in production, of course you can, but just be careful with the queries. Surly Dev says, Circular Life asks, where did DBAs in big enterprises keep database master keys and certificates? I'm a noob and learning DB administration. Most of them don't encrypt their databases at all. But you didn't hear that from me. Most of them don't encrypt their databases at all. The few ones who do, they don't usually use best practices. They usually have some kind of secrets repository that the entire enterprise team or like the sysadmin team uses to store things like passwords for external services, passwords for service accounts, and they just dump them inside there. There are appliances that you can use to store those kinds of keys and certificates. I just hardly ever see anybody using them. Part of it, though, is because I don't work with big, giant enterprises. Like General Motors or Ferrari isn't calling me up for help. They tend to call other big, giant consulting firms. But since you're just getting started, here's the thing I would tell you, don't worry about that. That's not going to be a barrier that keeps you from getting a job because no DBA will know the tool that's going to be used by the team that they go to work for because they're all different. Let's see here. Next up, Ethermat or other Matt. Other Math says, for databases on a HCI with a mix of SSDs and spinning Rust. Hey, folks, you try and keep your questions relatively short, like 1 or 2 sentences. But like if it's going to take me 60 seconds to read through, we're probably going to have a bad time. So let's rephrase this. I'm just going to try and pull the shortest version out of this. Are there any downsides to look out for when page compressing larger tables? Yeah, implementing page compression is a size of data operation. So SQL Server is going to have to scan the entire table and write the entire table out again. So you're looking at long transaction log churn, large transaction logs, a lot of communication going back and forth to your availability group secondaries, your differential backups become larger. It is a really big deal. Next up, we have Albert says, we have an index maintenance job which runs every weekend. What it does is changes the recovery model from full to bulk, and like, oh man, and after completion back to full. Is this a good practice? Not no, but hell no. Are there any drawbacks? Yes. The first thing that I worry about is the ability to do point-in-time recovery. So I would question why somebody did that, what their goal was. I'm really suspicious that somebody might have picked it up on a blog somewhere and didn't really understand what they're doing. The place to start is ask your management, when the server goes down, how much data am I allowed to lose? And if they start asking, well, what do you mean allowed to lose? You're not supposed to lose any data. Then that's when you quietly switch that setting back and don't do that. Next up, let's see here. Mirka says from over in Facebook, when I'm writing a good performing query, would you recommend to check it on IO statistics first or IO time? Oh, okay. So generally, when I'm out in the public, I generally teach people to look at statistics IO, the number of 8K pages that people read or that a query reads. Because generally, the less pages that you read, the faster your query is going to go. However, there are edge cases where you're trying to get every last mile out of performance and you have to start looking at CPU, and a query that reads a little bit more data but does less CPU work may be a better alternative. That's a rare case. I think it probably happens on 1 client out of 10 that I work with. Most of the time, I'll tell people if you're just getting started, just look at logical reads. That's usually the easiest, fastest way to measure. Plus, too, statistics time is all over the place when other things are running on your server. It can be really unpredictable, hard to measure results, whereas logical reads is pretty doggone consistent. Next up, Ramiz says, I have more than 2 terabytes of free space available in my database. When I try to shrink it, I see the data file size is reduced, but the DBCC query keeps executing. Shrinking sucks pretty bad. Shrinking sucks pretty bad, especially when you're trying to get rid of 2 terabytes, because it's going to be a little hard to explain without running through slides. But imagine that the data file is the length of my desk. What SQL Server does is it goes to the very end of the data file, takes the last page, and moves it to the first unoccupied page in chat. My goodness. So it takes it to the first unoccupied page. So when it's moving just 1 8K page at a time, and you're trying to get 2 terabytes worth of stuff freed up, you can kind of imagine how that's a really slow process. The thing I would start with is, if you've got, say, the whole thing is only 3 terabytes and 2 terabytes of which are empty, you might actually be faster creating a new data file and moving everything over into it. So if you search for shrinking on my blog, so if I say shrink on site brenozar.com, so up here at the top, I'll go shrink site brenozar.com. What if you really do need to shrink a database? That's got a post that talks about what happens when you absolutely have to shrink a database. What you do is go move the objects into a new file group, and that's usually faster. New file and or new file group. Let's see, coming back over here. Who have we got next? Yunus says, hi, may you explain how frequently SQL Server does a checkpoint? You know, it's been a while since I read this section of books online, and I want to say it's every 60 seconds, and I want to say that in newer versions you can adjust that and make it run way faster. I don't remember off the top of my head, though. What I would say is if you're really into that, go pick up a SQL Server internals book. There are a bunch of them. The internals books haven't gone out much in the last 10 or 15 years. Things have changed in the last 10 or 15 years, but that'll give you that good foundation if you want that. I'll tell you this, though. In the probably 10, 12 years that I've been doing consulting, I think I've only needed to know the answer to that maybe twice. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. Next, but there's the answer if you want to go for it. Krishnada says, how do you optimize a stored procedure which might continuously change plans every 3 to 4 minutes? Oh, that's a great question. I have an entire class on that, 2 of them actually, called Fundamentals of Parameter Sniffing and Mastering Parameter Sniffing. In my Fundamentals of Parameter Sniffing class, I explain what parameter sniffing is and how to understand when it's happening to you. In Mastering Parameter Sniffing, I teach you how to gather those plans, how to see the differences between those plans, how to measure which plans are going to work best for the widest number of queries, how to cache multiple plans at the same time for the same queries, how to identify when you need query hints or option recompile, and much more. That is my Mastering Parameter Sniffing class. It's 3 days long, comes with all kinds of hands-on labs where you actually have to fix parameter sniffing problems, where I give you a workload and you have to use tools like SP Blitz Cache, Query Store, you name it, in order to fix those. All of a sudden, my white balance goes a little weird because the sun is rising, so let's go brighten that up just a little. Next up, it's control cases. I've used Power BI Desktop and it's terribly slow. It comes down to how you use it and what kinds of queries you're running, so it's definitely possible. Next up, Santa asks, any gotchas to keep an eye out for moving my 1.5 terabyte database to an always-on availability group with a synchronous commit secondary? Oh my gosh, so many. So many I almost don't even know where to begin. It's so huge. Oh my gosh, I don't even know where to begin. I will tell you this, the thing that hits me probably the most is log speed on the secondary. The people think that they're going to be able to just add a synchronous secondary and that the performance of the log file on the secondary won't be a big deal. Like if it's going to add 2, 3, 4 milliseconds of write time on the secondary, that it's not really going to matter. And they forget about all the inefficiencies of talking across the network, writing to the log file and sending the ACK back. It is so much bigger than it looks. Unfortunately, this isn't a small, easy project. The other thing I'd start by is look at the size of your transaction log during the course of a 1 day, because you're probably doing log backups every 15 minutes, whatever. Look at the size of the log backups over the course of a day and then go from there. That's going to inform you as to how much is going to change through the course of the day and how screwed you are. Next up, Asim says, switching to cardinality, I think it means compatibility level 130, can slow down some queries. How do I pinpoint in advance which queries are going to get slower? You run them. Right? I'm not a psychic. I can't tell what queries are. Let me guess. I'm feeling a disturbance in gut customer balance. I think that would be like a psychic commercial, right? Who's going to really buy into that? You're not going to guess. You just know. You go run them. You go find out. So you go run a repeatable load test and go from there. It's a fair question. It's just, come on, think about it in terms of how could you guess which ones are going to go slower. Sandeep asks, hi Brent, why do we see more number of SPIDs and sys processes when we set maxstop to a definite number? Like we set maxstop to 8, but we see 20 SPIDs on the instance. What maxstop controls is about the number of threads that one query runs. It does not control how many queries run at the same time. So just because you set max degree of parallelism to say each query can only use 8 cores, that doesn't mean you're only going to run 8 queries at once. Users can run all kinds of queries, and there's no cap on that you control. Like I only allow so many incoming queries at once. There's some cheesy ways that you could try to cap the number of queries people can run at a time. I would highly recommend against that, because when an emergency strikes, you won't be able to get in easily without knowing tricks like the DAC. Next up, Sukhvir says, good to see you again, Sukhvir. Any resources or tips for improving performance of FileStream? No. He says, we've been using it a lot and it would be a lot of work to shift to a file server. Yeah, no, I got absolutely nothing, because this is again where it comes down to me coaching with clients. Would you rather spend $2,000 a core for a file server or $0 a core for a file server. That's go use Windows or Linux or Amazon S3 or Azure Blob Storage. That's practically free compared to spending $2,000 a core on SQL Server for standard. Just doesn't make sense. Next up, GeoCerm says a customer of my friend, I like that, that's pretty good, is required to set up encryption on SQL Server connections. How much does encryption impact CPU load? Oh, that's a good question. So for me, I never really get to control that. I'm just like, so you need it? So that means we got to turn it on, right? Okay. I'm going to go do it. And if it takes more overhead, you're going to have to pay for that. But it's not like you can negotiate. It's not like you can say, well, look, I know you need encryption, but it's going to cost you. You know, it's just you're going to have to turn it on. So go turn it on and go rock and roll from there. Next up, do you or does anyone in chat know about tools or utilities that will help me take the results from a query and turn it into a series of insert statements? The what? Basically, I want to take some data from, do a setup of testing, insert into, I'm not, SSIS. I think that's just SSIS. So SSIS will pull data from one server, bring it in somewhere, and then you can push it somewhere else. You can do things to it in the middle if you want, like export it to Excel. But SSIS is SQL Server Integration Services. So SQL Server Integration Services. I'm going to answer that one just instead of copy pasting it back and forth, fixing from Facebook. Should you turn off Windows Auto Defrag on a SQL server? For me personally, I've never found that as the thing that causes me to get across the finish line. Like I've never been like, oh, if only you would have turned off the auto defrag, we would have been fine. Because typically on a SQL server, there just aren't that many files anyway, and they don't change that much other than the SQL Server files, which can't be defragmented since they're in use. So it's not that big of a deal. Kirubil says, how can you tell if the person you're interviewing is lying on his resume, like with experience? My favorite way of doing interviewing is while you're getting ready to hire someone, gather screenshots of the kinds of things that will be on their monitor while they're doing their job. Here's what I mean by that. If I'm hiring a production database administrator, then as I'm doing database administration for the company, I'm going to gather screenshots of problems that I hit. Say that I take over a SQL server and tempdb isn't configured correctly. It's only got 3 data files and they're all different sizes. I'll take a picture of the tempdb configuration screen. And then when we're interviewing, I'm going to say, here's the deal. I'm going to show you a series of screenshots. When you see what's on the screen, talk me through how you would react if you saw that up on your screen. Where's the screen from? What does it mean? What might you do with that screen? What might be the problems or benefits that you would see on that screen? And that way, you know right away, if somebody's looking at the tempdb config, they're like, oh yeah, that's a configuration of tempdb. You got an uneven number of files there. I would probably just set it to an even number of files. And then I can ask, okay, so why? What is that going to benefit things? Are there any risks? Are there any drawbacks? So that way, if you just put screenshots up on the screen of things that they should have seen when they were doing their job, you'll know right away if they're bluffing. Because you can't prep for that. People who will be just kind of squinting and trying to figure it out, you can tell that they don't have experience. Onkar says, hello, Brent. What about instant file initialization default, on or off? From SQL Server 2016, it's enabled by default. So when you have questions about how to set up a SQL server, check this out. So go to brentozar.com, and then up at the top, there's a button that says scripts. You can click on the scripts button and then go download my first responder kit. And in the first responder kit, I've got how to set up your SQL server, what changes you should make from the defaults, and why. I walk you all in over through that. That's at brentozar.com, and then click scripts up at the top. Totally free, doesn't cost you a cent, covers all kinds of SQL Server configuration stuff. Next up, Eric Lund asks, in a previous Q&A, you mentioned that Microsoft certifications are garbage. Can you elaborate? Sure, they're hot garbage. Hot, smelly Garbage. So what do I mean by that? And I have to clarify because I know Neil's in here and Neil's getting ready to sharpen a knife and come after me with it. What Microsoft certifications measure is what the Microsoft team, the Microsoft marketing team that wrote that certification wants to measure. Those people are not doing database administration or ETL or Power BI or whatever it is. All they're doing is writing queries that match, or writing questions that data trains us on a plane. They're writing questions that match some kind of mix of material that they want to measure. It has nothing to do with what these people do in real life. And I'll give you a classic pair of examples. The database administration exam has never asked you, hey, can you go check to see if your databases are backed up? And then if they're not, how do you know that they're not? Like, what's the proof that you have? This was DBA. So like the first thing. It's the first thing you have to do. What do you troubleshoot when the SQL Server goes down? What are the first steps that you should do in order? What do you do when a query is slow? They measure things like, if you had to make an XML query that matched this output, which of these XML query options would you use? And I'm like, who has to memorize that? Trash. You know, it's just junk. So I don't think, mild-mannered John says you're supposed to say, my friend says they're garbage. I will go right down in public and say those things are just hot garbage. They are meaningless. I know so many people who've gotten Microsoft certifications when they had no idea how to do the job. And conversely, I know so many people who do an amazing job and they can't pass the certification tests because those tests don't measure what the job says. So that's why I say they're garbage. And I feel passionately about that, as you can clearly see. Oh, we actually got that one already. So let's see. Next up, Celso says, hi, Brent. In an always-on availability group, I'm going to assume you mean availability group setup, is there a way to set up auto failover to a remote disaster recovery site? A small network blip shouldn't cause a failover. Is it okay to tweak timeouts and an Azure file share witness? SQL Server will never automatically fail over if you will lose data. It requires a human being to push a button, or, series of buttons, run commands, whatever. Requires them to push a series of buttons if you're going to fail over and lose data. Failing over to DR sites almost always involve losing data because how you usually configure replication to DR is asynchronously. Not synchronous replication, you would use async. So SQL Server built in will never fail over automatically if you're going to lose data and because you're using async. There are two ways around that. One is to use sync replication to your DR site. That, of course, is going to involve hellacious latency unless you invest a whole lot of money in things like dark fiber. The other way that you can work around that is to build your own failover mechanism. For example, I have one client that runs a service in their DR site. It watches for network connectivity. That's true. Michael J. Swartz, absolutely true. Studying for the cert exams is valuable because it teaches you the different things that are available in SQL Server. So this client in their DR site runs a service and it watches for the production website. If the production website is down for more than, say, 15 minutes, then it initiates a failover. It'll bring the DR site live, and it does all kinds of things like bringing the availability group live, making sure the backups are running on the AG, changing firewall configurations and all of that. But it wouldn't be something you would want to take lightly. All right, a quick shout out to this week's sponsor. This week's sponsor is my Black Friday sale. So right now over at brentozar.com/Black Friday, massive savings on a level 1 bundle that gets you a recorded class season pass, SQL Constant Care, the consultant toolkit. That's all just $295 for an entire year. Then my level 2 bundle for $995 a year, you get access to all of my live online training classes, my mastering classes, new fundamentals classes that I've been bringing out. So all that's over at brentozar.com/Black Friday. Sales are open now through the end of the month, so all during November. Coming back over here, let's see. Negu asks, is that the good reason to turn on the legacy CE if 2012 upgraded to 2016 and I'm getting slow performance for a few queries only? I usually tell people to just leave compat level at whatever it was before you upgraded. Like if you were on 2012 and you were on the 2012 compat level, when you go to 2016, just leave it on the 2012 compat level for a while because it'll be predictable. Otherwise, they're going to blame you whenever something goes terribly wrong. Yeah, Iceman Rider, unfortunately, if the governments pass legislation without making it easier for small businesses to work, then that doesn't go so well. Oleg says, morning, Oleg, good to see you. What are your thoughts about using JSON inside the database for some edge cases, maybe indexing, other gotchas performance-wise when I have to use it? So one way you could think about it is, if you want to make your salary look less expensive, what you could do is use SQL Server as a file server. So it's a great place to store your MP3s, PDFs, XML blobs. Put JSON in there. You can't index it very well. You can only do computed column indexing. Your CPU will go through the roof, just like as if you were trying to find contents of XML or MP3s or your movie collection. All of a sudden, your SQL Server licensing will be way higher and your salary will look less expensive. But the key to doing this is you got to make it look like it was someone else's idea. You got to make it seem like someone else was hey, Bob over there said it was really, we had to put JSON in the database. Bob, wasn't that what you said? So you want to get really good at being able to do things like that before you tell somebody that it's their deal. My wife is texting me, so let me go respond to her really quickly. Streaming now. You're on screen. There we go. So next up, Control K, Control C says, any gotchas on not shrinking tempdb data files while log reuse weight is nothing for tempdb? So my general feeling is don't do that. Tempdb probably grew because you needed the space. Data train Cosmos DB for JSON. There's a free tier now. Dude, seriously, would you call Cosmos DB an expensive or an inexpensive way to scale? This is like the crack dealer saying, your first hit is free. Everyone, go enjoy crack. It's completely free. Microsoft will give you your first hit for free. We're irresponsible professionals if we tell people to store JSON data inside Cosmos DB. Come on. So Control K, Control C, especially if we're talking about an inexpensive alternative to SQL Server. That's just banana pants. Azure Blob Storage. Come on now. Control K, Control C says, any gotchas on shrinking tempdb data files? Don't do that. Don't do that. It's not a good idea. So step back and what's the problem we're trying to solve here? But I'm not a big fan of trying to do that. Mike says, about the interviewing piece, good to see you, Mike. I love to ask a question. Mike, also, I'm not following you on Twitter right now because you're going off the rails, but the instant the election is over, I'm going to be right there back with you. And it's nothing personal. It's just anybody who tweets anything politics related. God knows there's enough out there. I love to ask a question that they won't likely know the answer to. Yes. Oh, yes. Oh, who was it? I can't remember if it was Nick Kane. Somebody was the first person that I heard that from, was if they don't say I don't know at least once in the interview, then they're probably full of poop. So I want to say it was Nick that was like, I'm going to push harder and harder until I hear them admit that I don't know. And it sounds like you're grilling the person, but that's not what it's about. You're just trying to see how far you have to push them before they say I don't know. And oh my gosh, it's so good when a candidate will say I don't know. That's just absolutely magical. Abuse sysadmin says, I like to ask for war stories. If they have experience, they will have had a bad day or a time that they screwed up. If they haven't had a bad day, they lack experience. There's also a cultural thing, though. Like in some cultures, it's bad to ever admit that you had something bad for a previous employer. Because it's kind of like trash talking your employer. Like maybe the employer put restrictions on you and you don't want to say bad things about whatever was going on there. So I used to do that. I used to really say, hey, tell me about your worst problem over there. But also it puts them in a real bad mental place. Like it may make them awkward or whatever. So what I will tell them is ask them, tell me about a thing you're really proud of, something that you really love doing, like your favorite moment from the last year or two. And that seems to work better. Igor says, hi, I'm from Russia. Welcome. My friend says, what do you think about hash match physical operator? I mean, how do you think about how it works the same? I'm not sure. Tell me what the problem is you're trying to solve. Like, what's the problem that you're trying to solve with? And let's go from there, because I'm not really sure what you're asking. If you're asking me how hash match indexes work behind the scenes, instead, go check out MS SQL Tips. So MS SQL Tips has a good post on this. MS SQL Tips join operators. So they have understanding SQL Server physical joins. I think that's the only good free resource I've ever seen on it. But I would just say, like, what's the problem you're trying to solve? Whenever you're a professional, there are two reasons to learn. One is because you're curious, and curiosity is awesome. But God, I would not be curious about that, because there's really nothing you can do about it. It's not like you can tweak something and they work better. Or when you're trying to solve a problem, generally I would coach folks to learn to solve a problem rather than just learning stuff that you have absolutely no control over. If you're the kind of person who wants to know the internals of how these work, I wouldn't use a closed source database system. Instead, I would use an open source database system, because you can actually read the code. This is where MySQL and Postgres are a little bit more fun to work with. All right, last question we'll do before we take a bio break. So last one before a bio break. Onkar says, what is the default instant file initialization setting? The default is disabled for security reasons. From SQL 26, it is not enabled, or 2016 is not enabled by default. You have to opt into it because there are security issues when you turn it on. All right, so we'll go take a 5-minute bio break. We'll take a 5-minute bio break. When we come back, we'll keep going with the questions. I will see you back here in 5 minutes. Welcome back, party people. So let's get into deeper into some questions here. Let's see what we got. Control K, Control C, DBA says, yeah, I've had MCP since SQL Server 2000 into 2016, and I can say that the way Microsoft planned these exams and materials were garbage. Strongly agreed, Brent. Yeah, as far as I know, everybody who had the certs has that feeling. Everybody who makes the certs and makes money selling training material is like, the certificates are awesome. You should get a certification today. I can help you with it for that just $199.95. So yeah, I'm just not really a big fan of it. They will help you stand out if you're in a big, huge pile of resumes. But if you're in a big, huge pile of resumes, you're fighting with the lowest price competitor anyway, and you're already screwed. You want to build personal connections, talk with people that you've networked with in the past, get to know people online. And then that way, when you need a job, there are going to be lots of opportunities for you, and you won't have to fight with the lowest bidder. Next up, Tejas says, according to you, what should be included in an upcoming SQL Server version in terms of features and why? You know what's funny? Somebody else asked this on a recent webcast, and I'm going to repeat what I said there. I actually think that SQL Server is really good these days. It's really good. And if I had to ask for anything, it would be less bugs. I wish they would stop slinging features that nobody... Hey, everybody, we got Kubernetes, Linux, SQL Server containers with Kubernetes and high availability, and then they immediately yank it as the thing goes into production because it's not stable enough to go live. I'm like, maybe you should just ease off on the bells and whistles for a while and make sure that the things that you put out don't actually suck. The same thing with the JSON, the Python, the R support, Java support. They're slinging so much distributed availability groups. They're slinging so much stuff out with almost no support functionality or controllability or performance tuning whatsoever. I'm like, maybe you should stop slinging out half-baked features and instead maybe do some quality control for a while. Kind of tighten things up. And they're like, but quality control doesn't sell things. And I'm like, well, then now you understand why people are staying on older versions and they're not going to SQL Server 3046, which is so damn half-baked. Next up, Myresh says, good morning. What would be some recommended approaches to bring around 100 gigs database down from Azure SQL DB to on-premises? Oh yeah, another person trying to check out a Hotel California. So I jokingly say that Azure SQL DB is like Hotel California because your data checks in, but it doesn't check back out. What you end up doing is using replication type tools that will watch for changes up in Azure SQL DB and replicate them down on premises. It's going to be things like Azure Data Factory. If you want to roll your own replication, if you want to do any kind of detection tool that'll check and watch to see when data changes up there and bring it down on premises, or if you just want to take just a plain old outage and copy the data across, but it is going to suck regardless. The nicer way to do it is instead of jumping all the way from Azure SQL DB down to on premises, is try to jump from Azure SQL DB over to another VM in Azure first. Because that way you can get relatively high bandwidth between the two. Then once you're on a regular SQL server in an Azure VM, then it's easier to set up things like log shipping, availability groups to push the data back down on premises. Next up, Rangarajan says, SP Blitz says some cores are inaccessible to SQL Server due to affinity masking or licensing problem. My client says they have all valid licensing for the SQL Server. It's a very common problem. So make sure that when you see a URL in SP Blitz that you copy paste it into your browser and you actually read it. The information is actually in there in that web page for you to go read. So I won't repeat it here because I put so much work into that page that you can read for free. For free, you don't even have to pay. So there you go. So go do that. Next up, Bankaraj says, a SQL Server alert for always-on role change. I love that. That's really cool. Sends each of the databases in an availability group. Is there an option to just send one consolidated alert for all of the databases? I don't know for that. That's a really good question. Ask that over on Stack Exchange, because I bet somebody's figured out a workaround. But you know what? I love that you even know that that exists. Most people don't even know that it exists, and I think that that's just such a cool feature. That's really slick. Taya says, do you think AMD processors will take over for Intel for smaller organization SQL servers? Do you think Intel is better for SQL Server or otherwise? My feeling with that is just usually that I don't get to be involved in the purchasing of the SQL Server. Usually I come in the back end, like after the server's already been bought, and I have to make that pig fly. And organizations tend not to buy new SQL servers very quickly. They tend to hold on to them for long periods of time because swapping out the servers is just such a giant pain in the rear. The place where I would tend to see, Neil, I'm not going to dig deeper into that. So don't, if you're not doing things in JSON, don't process them in SQL Server. Don't do that. You do that on an app server. So for me, the place that I would find these more effective is go put them in your VMware or Hyper-V farms, because it's relatively interchangeable inside there for using AMDs as app servers, web servers, whatever. And then as you gain confidence and familiarity with them, it's real easy to just slide SQL Server VMs over there, depending on how you do your licensing. Move them over towards those servers. For smaller servers, it's not that big of a deal. But that's where I see AMD is probably having a bigger, more rapid adoption first, because companies can switch in and out their VM hosts relatively quickly without reinstalling things like SQL Server. Next up, Aries says, I created OData APIs to connect to SQL Server and expose the tables directly in Salesforce. Have you worked with a similar setup? So if you want, I think what you're saying is you wanted people in Salesforce to be able to query SQL Server. The pros and cons of that. So I'd say it's kind of like anything else with an API that lets people write queries in ways that I might not be comfortable with. You're eventually thinking of Salesforce as a reporting tool. I would be really careful of tools that let end users decide what data they want from SQL Server when. There tends to be a lot of heartbreak at the end of those roads. Next up, oh, poor CGS. So Chris says, is there a roadmap for converting merge statements to less problematic code constructs? No, I have not seen one of those. And I've just had like 3 clients in a row that all had to deal with moving merge statements back to conventional insert, update, delete type patterns. I haven't seen a generic converter because usually when people decide they want to back out of merge, they do other things as well. Like they do their own custom change detection to see whether or not a row has changed. They have other business logic going on where they're dealing with like parent-child type tables. So I've never seen a code generator that worked well. Plus, you kind of have to know about the real primary keys of the tables. I can't tell you how many times I've popped open a merge and I've been like, these aren't even unique columns. You realize that if things go wrong here, you're going to get duplicate data. So next up, Thin Black Line says, in what cases is a heap table the best choice for a clustered table for a transactional database? I often say, tell me the problem you're trying to solve rather than saying, I have this hammer. Where can I put this hammer? Because if you ask a stranger where you can put this hammer, you're going to get some ideas that may involve Vaseline and nudity. So rather than taking the hammer and trying to figure out where to put it, maybe put the hammer down for a second and look to see the problems that you need to solve. Now, having said that, if you said, here, Brent, here's $10,000 in order to answer that question, I would say if you only cared about dumping a bunch of data in and then pulling it all back out and truncating it every day, which that probably doesn't sound like a transactional kind of server. Folks, as a quick reminder, so what we talked about at the beginning, when you ask questions, please only ask them once. Just ask them once. We're going through first come, first serve. They're going into a queue. If you ask multiple times, what we do is we just ban you on the chat, so be careful on that one. Next up, Raman says, what are the disadvantages of offloading CheckDB to another server? I think I can't remember if I didn't do a blog. I don't think I did a blog post on this. I think I just did a tweet. Almost every time, if not every time, almost every time I've ever gone into a client and they've been offloading CheckDB somewhere else, almost every time I've said, walk me through your process. Let's go look at the scripts. And almost every time there have been bugs where they've been just totally absorbing the failure messages and not kicking them back to production. I'll give you a great example from one of my favorite cases. A whole room full of professional DBAs sitting around a conference room table. Very sharp people that I respected. Very large database, like a 25 terabyte database. They said, well, CheckDB just can't run fast enough on production, so we restore it over here and then we run CheckDB against it. As I always do, I say, okay, show it to me. So we go look over at the server and we start digging through the logs of, what happened last night, last time that they ran the restore and did CheckDB. And the restore was failing. What had happened was that they ran out of disk space. And their restore process had two parts. It would restore the database to a new name. After the restore succeeded, they would delete the old database, switch in the new restore, and then run CheckDB on it. But the restore part was failing. And the way that they'd set up their job was to say, just go on to the next step anyway, because we have a lot of databases and we want to make sure we hit them all. The restore failed, and then the CheckDB step ran, and it was checking the last restored database, which had never been deleted or renamed. So over and over again, they were checking an old database, and it was passing, but they weren't checking the current database because they were swallowing that error about the restore failing. So the problem with offloading CheckDB isn't the process. The problem is how you implement that process. And so often I find that IT professionals seem to default to believing that their process works. You should default to thinking that your process failed and then go prove that it actually succeeded. And that's when you have some eye-opening moments, because that's kind of my job as a consultant. I can't ever take in what anybody believes or what anybody believes is the truth. I have to go in and actually check and see, okay, do you have your pants on? Are they on forwards? Are they on your head? Are they on inside out? And that's when we have those eye-opening moments. M. Raman says, what are your thoughts on the DBA Tools PowerShell module? Is it safe to use in a big enterprise environment? Absolutely. And I don't use it at all myself, only because I don't have a big enterprise environment. I tend to performance tune one server at a time. And for what I do, PowerShell doesn't hold hope for me yet. But if I still managed multiple servers in an enterprise like I used to do, I would absolutely be using it today. And those of you who have to manage 30, 40, 50, or 100 SQL servers or more, PowerShell is the way that you do more stuff in less time. And DBA Tools is a great, efficient way to do all kinds of that stuff. Let's see here. Next up, Coyote McD, who's probably a fan of the McRib, says, I care about system stability performance. Yay! All right, that's great. Good to hear it. Very nice. Excellent. Devs care about new features and not technical debt. You'd be surprised. You'd be really surprised. How do I convince them that performance matters while also seeing their perspective? So there are, I got to think about gently about how I have this conversation. The people that matter are users. And if the users are happy with performance, that's fine. then the other people who care about performance are the ones who sign the checks for hardware. If they're happy with the hardware required in order to make that old code fly, then you should also be happy. Pick your hills that you want to die on really carefully. Because what it sounds like you might be saying is it sounds like you might be going into the developers and saying, your code sucks, this code's a piece of junk, man, this code is garbage, you gotta fix this code, it's terrible. And you might now understand why they're not being very open to you and not embracing your feelings. And Adrianix is one of the things I hate the most, is that my users are okay with my bad performance. So just because you believe that performance could be more amazing, that doesn't mean that that's the best use of your time. Now, if you do feel passionately about it, what I'll sometimes do with developers is go, here, I've rewritten one of your stored procedures. I've rewritten it. Here's the brand new version that goes way faster. Run this and you'll see I've got comments in there about what I changed and how I changed it. If you want, you can decide whether you want to keep it or not. If you want more help on similar stored procedures, just let me know. But that's it. You got to actually do it. You got to go meet them halfway by actually rewriting the code, because otherwise it sounds like you're just the grumpy person sitting over in the corner going, your code sucks. You should do better. You got to show them how to do better. If you can do it, and if you can't, you should zip it. Next up, Santa says, how do I convince my manager that Microsoft certifications don't reflect what I can actually do? Oh, that's easy. So what you do is you print out, so the Microsoft certification study guides will all have a list of things that they cover. Take that, print out the list of things that they cover, then write up a similar list of the things that you do and show the parts that overlap and show the parts that don't overlap. So for example, if one of my employees came to me with that, if I said, hey, Alicia, I want you to go get certified as a database developer. If Alicia came back to me and said, well, Brent, these are the tasks that I need to perform on a regular basis. The Microsoft task is, for example, measuring how well I memorize XML syntax. I'd be like, yeah, you're right, Alicia. I don't need you to measure memorize XML syntax. So that starts to help a lot. Joe says, where can I practice SQL problems? It just so happens I have classes for that. So over at my Black Friday sale, if you go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, my fundamentals and mastering classes all include hands-on labs where you have to fix problems in the Stack Overflow database. I give you the Stack Overflow database and a running workload of queries that I've written, queries that I've gathered from all over. And then I teach you, here are the performance anti-patterns in those. Now go solve them. And we work together, and then you get to watch me solving those exact same problems as well. So right now during the month of November, I've got a sale on those courses. If you go to brentozar.com/Black Friday, there are recordings as low as $195, going all the way up until, if you want to attend all my live classes for 2 years straight, that's $1,695 this month, down from like $6,000. So it's a really good deal. And one of the things that I'm proudest of is it really pushes you to solve real world type challenges, and you just don't get those from a book. Big, huge difference. Next up, DataTrain says, about certs, we need to improve them. I'm thinking maybe something like the MCM program, the Microsoft Certified Master Program, again, is needed at a few levels. The problem was Microsoft discontinued the Master Program because it didn't make money. Because if it's a real mastery program, most people can't pass. You're going to have a majority of people are probably going to be failing. You know, it's just not going to be an easy kind of test. So fewer people will take it, and it'll have a reputation for being hard. So it's going to have way less students, which means building the training material on a per student basis and building the test on a per student basis is going to be really expensive, because after all, only certified masters could write certified master type questions. So I can't even begin to guess what Microsoft Certified Master test costs. When I was involved in building the last round, I would guess like $1 to $2 million for set of tests. and they had to keep refreshing the tests because people would do brain dumps. So Microsoft was losing a ton of money on that program. That's why they killed the thing. And I don't foresee a real world issue where mastery type tests would be so affordable and profitable that people would be willing to do it. So it's kind of tough. Next up, Neil says, oh, we hit that. I mentioned that one. Close that. Yahor says, how do you live on AWS Aurora without column store? We don't do analytics queries. So what Yahor is referring to is we have SQL Constant Care. The backend for SQL Constant Care is up in AWS Aurora. We don't do analytical queries that involve trending across large data sets. We're looking at one server at a time, so it's very transactional. We roll through about 2 terabytes of data every 30 days. So we have thousands of SQL servers that are all sending us their diagnostic data. We are loading and deleting 2 terabytes worth of data every 30 days. It's actually a weak point for column store. It's not a strength of column store. So it's just about knowing where you're wearing the right fit is. Jonathan, pick up Itzik Ben-Gan books. Itzik Ben-Gan, and those will cover you there. Itzik Ben-Gan has a T-SQL fundamentals book that's absolutely excellent. Next up, Ralph asks, starting from SQL Server 2016, reorging column store indexes merges compressed row groups. The question is, do we have such a feature for small delta row groups? No. Love those fast answers. Next up, Bob the Lobster says, thanks for the free fundamentals classes. Ah, great. Glad you enjoyed it. Those were all kinds of fun. Bob says, have you seen any uses for column store indexes where the data is under 10 gigs? I have not. I have seen people say it made their queries faster, and when I've worked with them on it, we found that they weren't using the right row store indexes to begin with, or their queries were extremely poorly written. So I'm sure out there are cases where people don't know how to use row store, or they write really crappy queries and they don't know how to fix them, where column store has made sense. I've never found that scenario amongst clients where it works for me. My friend asks us, do you like my new avatar? I love it. That's really slick. I like that a lot. SQL Pilot says, prior to 2016, there was no DMV for function execution stats. Is there any way to find how much CPU function calls consume in earlier versions? That is such a great question. Here's how, and I use this exact wording with clients. Here's exactly how I word that with clients. Oh, performance is important to you, you say. Oh, and you're on SQL Server 2014. Oh, it's 2020 now. 2014's, it's not even under mainstream support anymore. Man, that's a real bummer because Microsoft has added so many cool features over to currently supported mainstream versions of SQL Server like 2017 and 2019. Man, if we were on those versions, my job would be so much easier. Would you like to get on those new versions? No. Okay, well, it's just going to cost you more. Here we go. And you don't have to have a whole lot of those conversations before the client sees the light, especially if you do demos for them on newer, more supported versions of SQL Server where you can show them how easy it is. So that's my exact approach. And then it looks like we have one more in the queue. That might even be it. Circular Life says, how do I encrypt data in motion? Data at rest is TDE encrypted. My friend says to use SSL. Could you help how to implement? I actually don't do any encryption work at all. Like I don't do any security work, any encryption work, because I think it really requires a specialist, someone who's really good at that kind of thing. It's just not something that I'm into. So I would ask that over on dba.stackexchange.com. I know vaguely what's involved in requiring SSL connections to SQL Server, but I wouldn't even come close to being able to tell you accurately how to do it. So Chris says, I want to test my DBA team with a fake corruption scenario. How do I corrupt a database? Oh, there's a great question. I'm glad you asked. So what you do is search for Steve, whoops, my keyboard turned off there, Steve Stedman Corruption Challenge. So Steve Stedman has this database corruption challenge. That one's the overview page. That's actually the one that I would hit there. So the database corruption challenge. He gives you 10 corrupt databases, and then your challenge is to recover as much data from them as possible. And he tells you a little background of what the scenario is. Kurt has the sample corrupt databases. Those are okay. I like these way better though, because these are 10 with a very wide variety of problems. And you can then go read the answers as to how those of us who participated, how we won that challenge. So that is a lot of fun there. Lots of fun. Next up, let's see here. Joe says, I'm just going to hit this one because it flew by. Why are you so obsessed with query optimization? Because you make a lot of money. I don't mean a little money. I mean a lot of money. The people I know who do query tuning make between $150,000 to $200,000 US per year when they work for companies that desperately need it, that are really focused on high performance. Performance is a feature. Every query has to go fast. 150 to 200 grand a year is pretty doggone good money when you don't necessarily have to be on call. So I like money, so I'm all about it. Next up, Andrew says, are your courses available in the UK yet? Unfortunately, the UK is building their own equivalent of GDPR, so sad trombone, no. I was really hoping to get our courses in the EU this year, but once the EU struck down the Privacy Shield Act, that was kind of the end of that. Like if the EU can't get their own laws together, then a small business like me can't possibly afford to stay in. Peter, no, I didn't see that one. Peter says, you skipped my question regarding the most exciting SQL 2019 feature. Is it in the queue still? Most exciting 29 feature for me is probably batch mode on row store. I'm a pretty big fan of batch mode on row store because it's relatively harmless when it backfires. It does backfire every now and then, but it just doesn't backfire that often, so it's relatively harmless. I should point out too, welcome to the club, Sanjeev. Those of you who want to get alerted whenever I do these totally free streams, because sometimes I do office hours, sometimes I will work on a demo that I'm working on. I'm actually kind of working on some cool tempdb demos that I want to show you all in a while. Follow me so you can subscribe to me on YouTube, Twitch, Facebook. Hit the subscribe or follow button depending on which platform you're looking at and wherever it's at, and then you'll get email notifications whenever I go live. Let's see. Oleg says, is there a difference between Varchar 4000 and Varchar Max? Yes, Varchar Max can store a whole lot more data, as you might cleverly guess by the name Max. I want to say the Max is like 2 gigs, so you can put a huge letter to grandma inside there. Pretty big difference. Joe says, where are there better solutions than join clauses? Solutions to what, I might ask? What's the problem that you're trying to solve? And then we can go from there. Coyote says, how do I find these companies? Remember how I was talking about earlier? Remember how I was talking about, I said, if you end up in a pile of resumes, you are boned. Well, if you want to be good at query optimization, you blog about it, present about it, answer questions at Stack Exchange about it. You want to put it out there as you continue to work professionally and share what you do. You put out there that you're good with it and people will be calling you. That's the goal of doing this kind of work. You want people to ring your phone and go, I need your help with this query that I'm working on. I know before I started doing consulting, I thought that I was going to have to do all kinds of cold calls, trying to ring people's doors to say, hey, do you need some help? But if you blog, present, be on YouTube, showing what you do, people will fall out of the skies going, hey, I need you. D. Tovey says, could we get a training if it's a private training session? Absolutely. You can click on training at the top of the site and private corporate training. My rates are $5,000 a day US, and so you can then hire me. The training catalog's on there. You can get a contract and all right online. Companies do it all the time. D. Tovey says, I know you hate these questions. No, I make money on that, so that's totally okay. Roman says, hi, Brent. Amazing trainings. Thanks for those Black Friday discounts. You're welcome. One question. As far as I know, execution plans don't change just as more memory added. Is it completely true? No. So SQL Server will make different decisions depending on how many CPUs cores it has and how much memory it has. So this is why one of the reasons why I'll say that the fastest, most accurate way to tune queries is on a box that is absolutely identical to production. Same databases, same configuration, same memory, same core count. The closer that it can be, the more accurately you can performance tune quickly. The less accurate that it is, the harder it is to catch all these subtle nuances. That's actually okay, because I'm going to bail after this. I'll bail as soon as this queue is empty. We got like 2 more questions, and I can hear my wife making coffee, so I'm going to go bail and go do breakfast here. Sukhvir says, I'm getting into performance tuning and would like to know more other than your classes. Why? Why? You're here all the time. Do you not like me? I think you like me. Oh, but he says, maybe for free or a roadmap that you would suggest. You know, it is really funny. It's really funny about that. So I had a client 2-3 months ago. I had a client say, could you give us a roadmap of your favorite resources from YouTube in order about how to do performance tuning? And I went going to look, and I couldn't build a list that I was really happy with. I had lists, and I was like, well, this one's okay, but then you kind of got to watch this other one, and there are parts of this that are wrong, and this is true. And I realized that I couldn't build a free set. And then I realized that's why people pay me for training classes. Speaking of which, right now they're on sale. BrentOzar.com/Black Friday. That's why I do what I do. I do tons of stuff out for free. I've totally thousands of blog posts with all kinds of free performance tuning advice. But when you want to get start to finish training classes, that's really where those come in. BrentOzar.com/Black Friday, like kind of shark in there right underneath. All right, and then the last one that I'll do, will be, let me go hitting right here and put that in. Oh, not that one. Go over to here. Here it was. Widub says, how do memory grants work with NVAR Max? Would it have to reserve 2 gigs? No, I'll show you a blog post where you can go find it out. So if you search for sitebrentozar.com memory grant data type, Eric Darling had a really good blog post about the memory grants and data type sizes. So if you Google on our site for memory grant data type, there are several posts in there that explain how the different data types work and what their memory grant estimations are. So to sum things up, thanks everybody for hanging out with me this weekend. Tons of fun. Now I'm going off to go first go have breakfast with my wife, and then I'm going to go work on my emergency client for this weekend doing performance tuning. So thanks for hanging out with me this week. I hope y'all have fun with the Black Friday sales. I always totally enjoy these. These are so much fun because I love going around and looking at all the different deals on different Black Friday sites and seeing like which TV I would want to get. I haven't bought a TV in like 3 or 4 years, but I still love going and shopping to see what all the different kinds are. So thanks everybody, and I will see y'all. I want to say, let me look at my calendar because I don't remember what I'm doing next week. Let me go see. My next weekend is, I'm teaching mastering index tuning. This weekend is starting Friday is my next mastering index tuning class. So those of you who get in on the Black Friday bundles, if you go buy a live class season pass, you can attend one of my mastering classes starting Friday. So I teach the 3-day mastering index tuning class on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm doing this to help people get in who I know a lot of people who've been waiting right at the edge to go jump in and get a brand new live class season pass. So then you can start watching the fundamentals of index tuning replay right away on your own, and then Friday start getting better at your job. So I will see y'all on Friday doing the mastering index tuning class. Adios, y'all.